Hi, this is Paul. Aaron Renn was recently at the PCA, I don't know what they call it, General Assembly or Convention. At CRC, we call it Synod, but it's basically their same thing. And they did an interview with him. The guys from the Theology Podcast did an interview with him. And, well, he said stuff.
It's also the case in European countries like Germany.
And it's really helped if I get my settings correct.
In the UK. And so, in essence, this is an overstatement, but for kind of Gen Z, sort of like the men are conservative, the women are liberal. And because religion is conservative coded, it's right coded, I think men are becoming more religious because it's bound up with a greater kind of set of cultural and political issues there. And so I think it's great that more men are in church, but I don't think we want, Christianity to become a cultural or a political artifact. And I would also say, we don't want it to become kind of gender coded. Just because it's been too female, we don't want it to be too male coded either. But I think that's part of it. The trad thing, in my view, I think, people talk about liquid modernity. People are looking for solid ground to stand on.
Yeah.
And so I sensed, especially the move to Orthodoxy, as a product of a deep alienation from modernity and Western culture and from America.
Okay, that word alienation is really key here, and I think he's right. And I listened to Aaron Renn very carefully because I think he's very sharp. And again and again and again, I think he usually has his finger on something that's going on.
Itself. And it's really interesting when you look at the primary examples of the people who would come into the Orthodoxy phenomenon. It's amazing how alienated they are. So let's take a guy like Paul Kingsnorth.
Right.
There's so many Paul Kingsnorth fanboys. I get in trouble every time I say something about Paul Kingsnorth, but I'm going to do it again. Paul Kingsnorth expatriated from the country where his family lived for 1,000 years. He adopted an essentially foreign faith. He lives essentially a primitivist lifestyle in rural Ireland, although online, as it were. He is deeply and explicitly critical of modern industrial society. This is a guy whose life, top to bottom, is characterized by a pervasive alienation from the world. Rod Dreher, I think it's notable, Rod Dreher also expatriated. He also had a crisis of faith in the Catholic Church. He also had a bad experience when he tried to go home. And again, I'm not saying these are bad things that these people have experienced or that's wrong, but when you embrace Orthodoxy, what you're basically saying is the West has failed. And therefore you're looking for solidity in another tradition. I think the trad Catholics, the Latin Mass people, have an element of that.
I found that to be such an interesting idea. The West has failed. I don't know if either Paul or Rod would say that quite that starkly, but Aaron Renn's point about alienation, I think, is a valid one. Certainly the case that both Paul Kingsnorth and Rod Dreher embraced Orthodoxy because clearly they were looking for a mysticism that they weren't finding. And Dreher, of course, he's, just had him on the podcast recently, and I'll be talking to him in Chicago at Midwestuary. But there's a lot going on here. Now, one of the areas that Aaron Renn really contributes to is the discussion about the former elite, the former state, the former state accumulation of churches.
Yes,
because I think this relates to the disillusionment.
Yeah. Well, I would say that if there's one thinker I would like to promote the rediscovery of, it's the sociologist Digby Baltzel, who he didn't create the term, but he popularized the term WASP for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And he has a very unique take on the decline of leadership in America. Basically, he's sort of the he died, and his work was initially developed in the 40s through the 70s. But he's very unique in how he analyzes elites in America and how he talks about that. Which even going back to his original doctoral dissertation at Columbia in the 40s, you can see the problem of leadership in America, the decline of leadership, is something that he sees happening and is a big theme of his work. What went wrong in America? And so he talks about that in terms of the defects of the old WASP establishment. He was a big critic of them in many ways, although he was part of that group. And by the way, maybe the only elite theorist, maybe the only person who wrote about the WASPs who actually was a WASP.
Right.
And if you read any book about the WASP establishment today,
right,
it is written by a non-WASP who clearly has an axe to grind. There was a book called WASP by Michael Knox Barron, I think was his name, came out not that long ago. I read it very early on. I'm like, this guy's either Catholic or he's a super, super disaffected WASP. And I Googled him, and of course, they brought up his New York Times wedding thing from a Catholic cathedral. So he's Catholic.
Right.
There's a new book called Flight of the Wasp by a guy named Michael Gross. It's deeply, deeply, I'm not sure the word, very hostile, extremely, extremely negative towards WASPs in its characterizations. And so all of it, I think Richard Brookhiser wrote a book about the WASP. He was Catholic. And so you really don't have anybody writing about this who's on the inside. And you can think about it sympathetically. Sort of like most of the critics of the 1950s were the dissidents of the 50s, the people who didn't like it. We didn't hear from the people who did like it.
Right. Let's dig into a little bit about what are your thoughts on why the WASPs were incapable of defending themselves?
Well, that's very, I would say, this is a little bit deviating from the problem elite, but I'd say they had a couple problems. One was they had demographic change in the country that they were unable to figure out how to respond to, in essence.
Right.
And so they would not, it's to say, we were not going to allow Jews in our country clubs. We're not going to allow Catholics and Jews in our club, basically. So that became a problem when the demographics of the country have changed. And it's not, 1911 anymore. It's now 1960. And, we're electing a Catholic president of the United States. But you're still, there are like U.S. senators, who are not getting invited, who not being able to join country clubs, like Barry Goldwater, who was raised Episcopalian. He was only half Jewish. But like, even if you just had like microscope, you couldn't get in. I can't remember the club. Whatever the big club is in Washington. Ambassadors from African nations were not allowed there because they were blacks. It's like, even people who reached the highest levels of society were still blackballed from things. Which, of course, those sorts of slights are very powerful.
Right.
And they also, so that was number one. Number two. The WASP really emerged as we understand them in the post-war era as a product of the Second Industrial Revolution. And in essence, managerialization, etc. They were no longer people who were running companies.
Right.
It was now like the corporate CEO who's a professional manager. So they no longer had the economic clout that, say, John D. Rockefeller Sr. had, or Andrew Carnegie, or people like that. Far, far less of that. And then, of course, you had these kind of trust fund kids with really nothing productive to do and who were kind of feeling guilty about their money and all of that stuff. So they had probably a lot of defects in just their liberal theology and many other things that they had. But in essence, it is interesting. They essentially did, ultimately give up without a fight. I mean, they turned the keys to our institutions over.
I remember it.
To, okay, here's Catholics and Jews. Here's the key to the car. You get to drive. And one thing you'll never see is like some Catholic writer saying, "Wow, we deserve our fair share of the criticism for the way things have turned out in America." Like, you'll never see that.
Right.
And that was sort of like what's his name, Joseph Bottom's book on an what was his book? It was called like An Anxious Age or something like that.
Oh,
I keep getting
yeah.
his book confused with Jonathan Haidt's new book.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking about.
But
yeah.
you know, his sort of thing, like, I'm like, why can't we just get like one Catholic guy like him who's like, yeah, maybe the Catholic moment didn't happen because we didn't deserve it and we actually aren't as good as we think.
Well,
You know, those sorts of things are like bothersome. But I think, and ultimately, like, we have completely different people running the country now
Right.
than we're running it in, you know, say the 1950s when we were building the post-war security architecture. And you and I might not care about all that old stuff, but believe me, a guy like Joe Biden does.
Yeah.
And like even the Washington Post was written to be like, wow, there are basically no WASPs in his administration.
Yeah,
A guy like Biden definitely is still nursing ethnic resentments.
Right.
And so there's a lot of this stuff there, but it's very complicated, all of what happened. But, you know, the WASPs themselves were very defective in many ways, sort of as a class. You know, they were, I think people tried to pin the blame for Vietnam on them, you know, even though it was, of course, the Catholic, you know, John F. Kennedy who got us into it.
Well,
even Lyndon Johnson and
Well, and the ruler of South Vietnam was Catholic as well. And I'm not trying to pin Vietnam on the Catholics. Now, obviously, there's a lot of history there. And when he first said post-war, I thought he meant the Civil War. You know, with all this talk about a post-war consensus, it's really helpful to kind of watch wars and how they move. Right now, it's interesting watching how the Ukraine war is reshaping the political map. Wars change things. Now, what we've seen in the Middle East, I think with some of what Israel has been doing, Israel in terms of going after Hamas and Hezbollah and then Iran, Israel's I think to the point of just saying, well, we're done with not taking these people out. We're just going to take them out and be done with it, or at least defang them and make sure there's not going to be any nukes coming our way. In the Ukraine war, it's very interesting because when that war started, all of the anxiety or a lot of the anxiety you'd pick up in the press was, during the war on terror, we downscaled all of that old hardware that we needed for the Cold War. What we really need, if we're facing another European war, are more artillery shells and more tanks and more, you know, we'll need all of those Cold War weapons. And of course, 2-3 years into this, right now, the artillery and the tanks are looking like obsolete weaponry in comparison to a world of drones. And as Ukraine and Russia are sort of in a drone arms race, and Europe, that had not been funding their military significantly for a long time, recognizes, we're behind on just about every measure. We should just jump ahead to the drones. And then, of course, with the questions about China and Taiwan, all of that is happening. Wars catalyze and move things forward. And in many ways, I think if you want to go back to the WASP consensus, you really have to go back to the American Civil War and how the Civil War basically cleans out the South, and the northern churches, in a way, reseed the church in the South, which doesn't completely deal with all of the issues that were in the southern churches before the war. Things will continue to remain. They're at the PCA grouping, which has a lot of Southern Presbyterians in it. And so what happens in the Civil War is you get then this, you have this period of Reconstruction. Of course, Lincoln is killed just before the end of the war. Lincoln will not be there to govern Reconstruction. Reconstruction, when it ends, basically sees a resentment in the South over the war. Jim Crow starts to set in, and of course Jim Crow is going to set in until the Civil Rights Movement. Part of what takes out the WASP class, and again, I believe it was Rusty Reno. I really have to find this quote. I don't remember who Rusty Reno was talking to, but he basically said, the counterculture revolution that happens in the 60s is not so much a disagreement with their parents' values as a disagreement with the hypocrisy of the WASP establishment. My wife and I finished watching Palm Royale on Apple TV, and it was quite a show. And part of what was so interesting about that show is it's set in 1969, and of course 1969 is this inflection point. If you haven't watched David Hoffman's YouTube, part of what David Hoffman does is, because he's an older guy and he's got a ton of film footage that he can rightfully use on YouTube, and he according to Burn Power, he guards it jealously. He does a lot of videos about the period of the 60s and the 70s because he's got all that footage. And it's really helpful to look back, because so often the looking back that we do distorts. So a big part, and again, we've been talking about this in the Christian Reformed Church in terms of the banana. I think Aaron Wren is correct with respect to the WASPs, that they did just sort of give up power. And what's, on one hand, in terms of a whole bunch of the narratives of power, you think they'd be celebrated for that, because again and again we hear, oh, people don't give up power, people don't give up power. The WASPs did give up power. And that giving up power was happening early. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is in some ways sort of the quintessential mid-century WASP, in that, well, he begins to open the door to the Catholics and the Jews in his cabinet. In his long presidency, again, 4 terms before the constitutional amendment, he begins to welcome Catholics and Jews in, and African Americans to a degree. Of course, that will pick up during the Civil Rights Movement. There is a sense in which the United States transitions from sort of a WASP ethno-national country really into a credo-national country, and tries to do that. And again, as Rusty Reno said, and I think he's correct, a big part of that was the children of the Second World, the children that came along after the Second World War, saw the hypocrisy of their parents. And if you look at, let's say, what Martin Luther King Jr. does again and again and again in his sermons, is he challenges the hypocrisy of the Founding Fathers. If you read his messages, he keeps going back to Jefferson and the Bill of Rights, and says, these things were promised to us, and they have not been made good. They need to be made good. And in many ways, that's what the Civil Rights Movement, that's what the women's movement tries to do. Now, you should remember that if you go back into the 19th century, after the Civil War, you have this period of Reconstruction, but you also have this Gilded Age, where these industrialists just begin to own more and more, and America really starts revving up in terms of the Industrial Revolution, westward expansion. You have the wars to finally pacify all of the Native Americans in the plains, and to basically control now the United States from sea to shining sea. And all of this is going to, of course, take a while to sort of roll through. You have the First World War that America tries to avoid. You get to this story, and it's a story about a woman born, an orphan, born of humble circumstances. I'll try not to give away too many spoilers. A woman who is born of humble circumstances, who marries sort of an outcast from the WASP life, and very much wants into the WASP establishment. Now, the WASPs aren't going to let her in because, well, she's not one of them, and her husband, who was one of them, is not so eager to let him in either. But all along the way, they're dealing with questions of, okay, I cannot see this woman, Grimgriz, and not recognize the shadow matriarchy. She plays it perfectly, and she does so here. But also along the way, well, amazing performance by Carol Burnett. And it was, now I'm myself as a boomer, it was so much fun to see Carol Burnett She's still got it. That woman can act more with her eyes than a lot of people can with their whole bodies. Really an amazing performance. Along the way, though, you will run into, see if I can find, let's say, the dissident women. Well, you've got nods to it where the children of the elites are rebelling against their parents. They have seen the hypocrisy. They have seen that their WASP status does not bring them happiness. They want happiness. They want drugs. They want freedom. And again, not everybody. And again, if you watch David Hoffman, you'll notice that, yes, very true. Most of the kids of the establishment were loyal and industrious and basically absorbed the values of their parents. It's interesting because even in something like Palm Royale, I'm getting a sense of the kinds of, now that we have these streaming services, we sort of have these, each of the streaming services tends to have their own culture as well. They have their own vibe as well. They have their own sort of segment as well. And Apple is very elite. You won't find, now in this, of course, set in 1969, they don't have any opportunity to show any Apple products. But if you watch Ted Lasso and some of these others, Apple products are pervasive within them. But yet Palm Royale already has within it a little bit of post-progressiveness. While most of the values of the post-war consensus are there within Apple culture, there are some nods that maybe the old holy / buzz / magic words are no longer governing and conquering and enchanting like they were. But one of the things that you very much get through this whole thing is that while it might look very post-war buttoned down, the bloom is off the rose, the society is fraying, changes are coming, and just keeping things under lid isn't going to cut it anymore. While I really appreciate a lot of Ren's critique with respect to evangelicals and the question of elite status in America, I think part of what happened with, let's say, the moderate or progressive evangelicals that really wanted to see the church not embrace stigma with respect to, I think, that was sort of the defining issue with respect to Obergefell and same-sex marriage. I mean, that was definitely the vibe in the CRC, that the CRC elites were saying, we need to do this. And we need to do this just like we needed to do the racial reconciliation, just like we needed to do the women's liberation. We need to do this. This is part of the march. Well, I think the march is probably over. And just like liberal storytelling is sort of running out, the video that I just completed today, in terms of, I think, even the attempt to Christianize same-sex marriage and sexuality is running out. And I think even though you've got someone like Paul Kingsnorth and Rod Dreher, I think Aaron is right with respect to alienation, but my challenge would be, who isn't alienated? To what degree is evangelical culture cohesive? It also has fragmented, and I think we're in this time of tremendous fragmentation. Now, the PCA has been one of the more successful breakoffs of the main line, but I don't expect the PCA to supplant the main line. someone sent me a tweet by Aaron about Redeemed Zoomer, who basically said, I don't know why everybody's picking on Redeemed Zoomer. The guy has guts. Whatever you think of his mission, he's got the kind of chutzpah that many of us should aspire to. And I think Ren is right. I'm very cautious to disagree with Aaron Ren, because Ren has, I think, a tremendously strong track record. But I think part of what Ren might be guilty of is, I think in some ways he's probably, like we were back in 2022, imagining that the Russian-Ukraine war is going to be a war like the Cold War. And I don't know that we can have a really firm grasp on what elite means anymore. I think Ren is right. If you look at, I'm going to modify what he said. If you look at someone like, so my mother lives in Whitensville, and I often go back to Whitensville. Mr. Whiten was one of these 19th, early 20th century industrialist magnates. They had a mill town in New England. And the reason my Frisian ancestors on my mother's side came to America was because the Mr. Whiten's cows that he used to provide for the dairy industry died in a cow influenza, and so he needed new dairy cows. And of course, the best dairy cows in the world were from the Netherlands, and the northern Netherlands, where the Frisians were. And the cow workers came over with the cows, and those are my relatives. And they planted the Christian Reformed Church in Whitensville, Massachusetts. And because everyone aspired to be a dairyman, but not everyone was going to be a dairyman in that area, well, a lot went to, like my grandfather, a lot went to work in the machine shops, Mr. Whiten's machine shops. Mrs. Whiten was influential in funding Wellesley College. It was that 19th century post-Civil War, that first progressive era at the end of the 19th century that in many ways dominates. Now, I think Cale Zeldin is correct that a lot of that comes apart in the Second World War. But some of it is held on to, and then, of course, it is finally the hypocrisy that the children, the baby boom generation, looks at their parents and says, you have all of these high-minded ideals that you use to fight the Nazis and to resist the communists, but you don't practice that at home. You treat Jews and Catholics and African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans and Asian Americans like second-class citizens, and it must end. And I think, for the most part, that kind of legalized discrimination did. Now, of course, then the page turns on the systemic stuff, which then will sort of roll into the wokeism. So I think in that way, the alienation that we see in Kingsnorth and Dreer is a package of this age and a re-putting together of, I think, a much larger metagelical Christian consensus. All right, that's this video.